From the world of politics.
A document that is classified top secret, that means that revealing that information was determined at the time to be something that would cause exceptionally grave damage to our national security.
To the world of business.
Even if you were at 3.8, we have inflation still well above target, around 8%, falling only gradually. Core inflation around 6-ish. You're still in negative territory.
This is Balance of Power with David Westin.
From Bloomberg World Headquarters in New York to our television and radio audiences worldwide, welcome to Balance of Power. We start today in Washington, where there is news on both the foreign relations and also domestic economic fronts. And to bring both of those and set up the hour really for us, we turn now to our Washington correspondent, Anne-Marie Hordern. Anne-Marie, thank you so much for being with us. Let's start with the foreign relations. I see that we're now talking with Iran, or at least talking through the Europeans with Iran again. Is this going to amount to anything?
Well, it's a little bit of deja vu, right, David? Because for 18 months, they've all been talking. But the Europeans say they had this final draft text. They were waiting for the Iranians to give them their response. But it does seem like the response wasn't or yes or no. It seems like there were some issues that Iran brought forward because the Europeans are now talking to those members in the United States, really working as this interlocker. What we heard from the foreign minister of Iran, Hossein Amir-Abdollahian, the other day was that if the U.S., he says, shows a realistic approach and flexibility, they think they can get to the end of this deal. But at the same time, we heard from the State Department yesterday, spokesperson Ned Price had said what has been negotiated is all that can be negotiated. So it depends whether or not what is in this draft text, if both sides are really able to finalize and agree that this should be the final agreement of the deal. But, you know, a lot of people in the oil market were thinking potentially this shows a path forward of more oil coming back online because agreement is there. I just don't know if I jump the gun that soon, given we've been here so many times in the past.
Okay, so we won't hold our breath, but we'll keep watching it. Let's turn back to domestic matters now. We have a bill signing. The president's coming off of vacation, I believe, to sign that Inflation Reduction Act. Tell us about that.
Yeah, that's right. So it's not the dream he wanted, or at least the dream of those very much so in the progressive wing of his party, of trillions of dollars, but it is billions of dollars in this Inflation Reduction Act. Most notably, you're going to see the president say this is a huge win in terms of the biggest climate deal from the United States, a ton of green provisions, especially when it comes to EVs and renewables, but also the fact that it brings down pharmaceutical prices and it lowers the deficit. So this is going to be something that the president is going, and the Democratic Party are really going to use ahead of those midterm elections. And I would say, though, David, one thing, of course, we want to mention, though, is that it is titled the Inflation Reduction Act, likely because they see in the polls inflation is the #1 concern going into the midterm elections. But the fact of the matter is, when you look at the studies, it seems to have a minimal impact when it comes to the actual inflation numbers.
Exactly. It is job one, inflation fighting right now. Thank you so much to Bloomberg's Anne-Marie Hordern. Well, as I say, inflation may be the #1 goal, but you all want to have inflation under control, if possible, without going into a recession. Yesterday, we talked with noted economist Niall Ferguson, and he said that we are headed for a recession. This is part of what he said.
And the data suggests that we're headed towards that hard landing. You know, the Empire State measure today was terrible. The data out of China are terrible. The data out of Europe are terrible. The employment report was positive, but payroll numbers are a backward-looking indicator, not a forward-looking indicator. So we are in a sharp slowdown. We had 2 negative quarters of growth in the first half. We're going towards a recession.
For his perspective on the U.S. economy, we turn now to Niall Ferguson. He's Senior Fellow at the Hoover Institution, columnist for Bloomberg Opinion, and author most recently of Doom, The Politics of Catastrophe. Niall, thank you so much for being back with us. You heard there what Mr. Rubini had to say. But as an economist, do you think the bigger problem is the danger of recession or the danger of inflation? Which do we need to be more worried about?
Well, first of all, the difference between me and my old friend Niall Rubini is that he's an economist and I'm an economic historian. To answer your question as an economic historian, inflation is a much more serious problem. It affects everybody. And historically, the consequences of elevated inflation have been negative, not only economically and socially, but also often politically. A recession, as we've discovered lately, is one of those things that you can argue about the definition of. But what we know from past experience is that when you get the kind of inflationary blow up that we've seen this year, it's pretty hard to bring inflation down without some kind of economic contraction. The Fed has tightened monetary policy. There's some tightening of fiscal policy also going on. And I think Nouriel Roubini is probably right that the US economy is at risk of recession. But the lesson of the 1970s is that that's the price you have to pay if you've made a major monetary policy and fiscal policy error and let inflation explode from 2% up to a peak of 9%. And it's unfortunate that no free lunches are available to get inflation back under control.
Neil, let's draw upon your expertise as an economic historian and compare it with some prior circumstances. One of the things that Nouriel Roubini said was that if we go into recession, it's going to be deep and it's going to be long. And the reason he said that is because historically we're at really high levels of relative debt, that is public and private debt in the United States and globally as well. He compared it, for example, to coming out of even the Depression, that we're a much higher percentage of GDP debt right now. Is that right? And does that mean that it's likely to be a deeper and longer recession?
Well, it's certainly right that debt in relation to GDP is at very high levels. Public debt is at the kind of level we saw in the wake of World War II in the United States. If one looks at private debt levels around the world, they're also extremely high. On the other hand, I'm not sure that necessarily means that you get a deeper and longer recession. It might mean that relatively small increases in borrowing costs suffice to cool the economy down. This is a little bit hard to call because the U.S. consumer is still consuming and spending, even if the consumer confidence surveys indicate a loss of confidence. There's quite a lot of momentum that dates back to all those stimulus checks that were dished out. And of course, the appetite, the pent-up appetite to consume that built up during the pandemic. My hunch, and it's no better than a hunch at the moment, is that there is a process of cooling, and it's true, as Nouriel said, the Empire State data that came out yesterday confirm that. The big question is, will it be enough to bring inflation down to where the Fed wants it, which is averaging 2%? We're a long, long way from there. And the rate hikes we've seen so far by historic standards, David, they're pretty modest. And I just want to remind viewers that in the 1970s, the Fed also engaged in tightening. The trouble was that it would blink, it would pause at the first sight of recession. And that was why inflation proved so persistent. Obviously, Jay Powell would love to be Paul Volcker, bringing inflation down under control, hopefully with not as much pain as Paul Volcker put the US economy through. But he could equally well, or maybe more likely, end up being Arthur Burns, who was the Fed chair during the great inflation of the 1970s. Inflation didn't go up steadily in the 70s. There were periods when it actually came down, 70, 72, 74 to 76. But the Fed would never quite get on top of it. And so I fear a repeat of that process where the Fed tightens, the economy slows, the Fed declares victory, everybody sighs with relief, and then inflation goes back up again at some point, maybe because of an external shock, or maybe because monetary policy is being eased prematurely and inflation expectations haven't really calmed down.
Neil, let me put one more overlay on that, and that is China. We also got economic data out of China over the weekend, really early yesterday, which really showed a slowing economy there. They have challenges that you know terribly well, whether it's their property market or some of the shutdowns they're doing because of COVID-19. They have unemployment, youth unemployment at 20%. How much is that likely to affect the United States economy as well? Will it drag us down?
Well, it's probably, from the point of view of the Fed, good news, because if China slows down, what that means most immediately is that China's demand for commodities slackens, and that's a disinflationary force right there. you'd certainly be feeling a somewhat different feeling if China was booming the way it did in that period after our financial crisis, when the Chinese did massive stimulus and they sent commodity prices skyrocketing as a result. So I think from the US perspective, it's probably on balance no bad thing that China is in fact growing much slowly than they intended. Remember, they had a 5.5% growth target. That's out the window. No way is that going to be met. But of course, if you look at the Chinese situation, it's good news in another sense. The US has a lot of reasons to worry about China. Remember all the kerfuffle over Taiwan we just had. In many ways, I think it's fair to say we're in something like a Cold War with China right now. Well, if the Chinese economy is flatlining, if the miracle years are over, if it turns out that actually China's situation is worse in terms of debt, terrible, much worse in terms of demographics, then the US can afford to be a little less afraid of the coming Chinese challenge. And it looks less and less likely that there's going to be a Chinese or an Asian century and that the US is going to have to accept playing second fiddle. I must say, when I look at the Chinese economy today, I'm less and less convinced that at some point the Chinese economy will overtake the US in current dollar terms. I made a bet a few years ago that that would never happen. I'm feeling good about that bet today.
Okay, well, thank you. As long as you're feeling good about your bet, thank you, Neil. It's always such a pleasure to have you with us. That's Niall Ferguson of the Hoover Institution. Coming up, we're going to go to the White House, where even in August, the administration is hard at work with Brian Deese. He's director of the National Economic Council. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Westin. Well, the White House is busy, even though it is in the middle of August. They have a big bill signing coming up, but there are also some other things that they're celebrating at the White House today. And to take us through it, we welcome now Brian Deese. He's director of the National Economic Council. Brian, thank you so much for being with us from the White House there. As I say, we've got the Inflation Reduction Act. There's going to be a signing this afternoon. The president's coming back to sign it. But before that, hearing aids. I didn't think we'd be talking about hearing aids, but tell us about it.
Well, so in America today, there's about 40 million people who suffer from mild to moderate hearing loss. And you think about people who are older, but also there are tens of millions of people who are in their 20s and 30s and 40s who have mild to moderate hearing loss. And there's been a regulation on the books for a long time that has required that you get a prescription. So you have to go see a doctor before you can be prescribed hearing aids. That operates as a barrier to entry, as economists say, reducing competition and driving up prices. So we're finalizing a rule today to eliminate that regulation and make hearing aids available for purchase over the counter. So this fall, starting this fall, you're going to be able to go into a pharmacy and buy hearing aids over the counter. That means a lot cheaper hearing aids. You could see hearing aids for a pair of those hearing aids come down on average by almost $3,000 a pair. And also, more competition means more innovation. There will be more ideas on the market because there's that, you take away that barrier of having to go get a prescription. So it's the kind of thing that'll have an impact in very practical ways on a lot of people's lives, and it's a tool that we have, and we've been working on it for some time. There's bipartisan support in Congress, and we're going to get it done.
So there's an example of something that in success, it's actually going to reduce the prices of some things pretty soon, which is something goodness knows all of us are looking for. You've already released that petroleum from the Strategic Petroleum Reserve to try to reduce the gas prices. Is there anything else in your toolbox for this fall that would reduce some prices?
Well, to that end, the Inflation Reduction Act that the president is signing today is the most significant thing that we can do. As you know, monetary policy is operating and the Fed is on a trajectory. If you think about what fiscal policy can do, this bill is the most significant and comprehensive approach to trying to reduce price pressures in very practical ways. For example, reducing healthcare premiums this fall for 13 million Americans, but also at the macro level by reducing the deficit, trying to reduce price pressures in the economy overall. So the president, in signing this bill, and then we'll have the hard work of implementing the key provisions of that bill over the coming months, is the most significant thing we can do, in addition to some of these regulatory administrative levers that we'll keep pulling.
So, Brian, just take us through that. Where do you think, which Americans will first see the real effects of the Inflation Reduction Act? Is it in the Affordable Care Act, the subsidies for their premiums? Is that the first place it'll hit real Americans?
Well, four things that'll hit really right away. The first is those Affordable Care Act premiums, where the letters from insurers will start going out in October. Without this bill, 13 million Americans would have seen big sticker shock that they won't see now. And so when the president signs today, they'll have the comfort of knowing that those lower premiums are locked in. Second, prescription drug prices. In addition to Medicare beginning the process of negotiating prescription drug prices, there's going to be a $2,000 cap on out-of-pocket costs for prescription drugs for people in Medicare. Third is consumer incentives for more clean energy and energy efficiency elements. So those provisions, many of them actually go into effect on enactment. So if a family is thinking about upgrading a boiler or air conditioning or putting in appliances, as families have to do, this bill will give them tax incentives and rebates to upgrade to more energy efficient alternatives. That saves them money, but also saves them money on their energy bills. And lastly, the deficit reduction, look, that operates at the macro, so no individual consumer is going to see that. But in terms of the market reaction and the space for the Fed to operate, that will, obviously, that will have an impact on enactment.
So as you and others of the White House have made very clear, including certainly the president, we want to try to get the prices down, at least to retard some of the increase in the prices in the fall. But the other concern that a lot of people have right now is the possibility of recession. We talk an awful lot about it. What's your take on the likelihood, possibility of recession over the next 6 to 12 months?
Well, we start with where we are, right? We're seeing strong and resilient labor market activity. We've seen that in the payroll data and also the unemployment rate down to 3.5%, which ties its lowest rate in 50 years. We also got industrial production this morning that showed sort of continued positive growth on the industrial side of activity. So there's no doubt that we're in a transition. It's a transition that our economy needs to get to that more stable growth. But if you look at the strength of our labor market, the ongoing resilience of household balance sheets and industrial production, certainly we believe that it's possible for us to make this transition in a way where we don't have to give up all of those economic gains. And so obviously there's a lot of uncertainty in the 6 to 12 month forward horizon. We're still very focused on some of the global threats that we face, including the energy markets and the second order implications of the war in Ukraine. But if you look at the steps we're taking and the policy actions we're taking, I think it's certainly the case that the Inflation Reduction Act, the CHIPS and Science Bill that we passed just a little while ago, those are going to help. They're going to help meaningfully in this transition.
Brian, a strong labor market, as you say, at least so far. We'll get more numbers at the end of next week. We'll get another read on that. But one place where there is not strength right now is the housing market. It seems like almost every day we get new numbers out, which are really indicating a substantial softening in the housing market. How concerned are you about that?
Well, certainly it's something that we're watching very closely. Obviously, as you know, this is the intended result of the Fed's tightening efforts, and it's the place where you perhaps see that tightening happen in the most direct way because of the impact on mortgage rates and that impact on economic activity. When we look at the housing market, our principal focus is around affordability. And one important element to this is to step back from the current moment. We have an affordability challenge in America that is driven by about a decade or more of underinvestment in housing supply. And so even as we look to address very immediate issues, the longer term answer to this question is building more affordable supply, particularly in parts of the country and jurisdictions where people want to move to economic opportunity. And so that takes real work with states and localities, changing zoning and land use policy. But we're looking at using policy tools creatively, for example, conditioning grants for transportation dollars on communities having more sound land use policies to build denser and more affordable housing.
Brian, finally, China. Let's talk about China. Obviously, there's been some uneasiness with China, but let's be frank, China has really driven a lot of global growth. China is having some difficulties right now. We saw those numbers come out about a weakening growth pattern in China right now. How likely is that to affect our own economy if, in fact, China is slowing down?
Well, certainly it has an impact, and we all and the American people have lived through the impacts over the course of the last several months when you see shutdowns or slowdowns in certain parts of China, that it does ripple through and affect our supply chains. But I do think that, your core question also highlights an important thing for the American people to recognize, which is the U.S. economy right now is in a stronger and a more resilient place than any other major economy globally, to actually navigate the global challenges that we face, which include potential growth slowdown in China, which also include the impact of the war in Ukraine. So we are in a stronger and more resilient place. Part of that is the fundamental strengths and unique positions of our economy, but part of that is the policy that we've put in place over the course of the last year and a half that position us better to deal with those. So certainly it's something that we are keeping a close eye on and will have impacts on our economy, but certainly less so than almost any other economy.
Brian, it's always a pleasure to have you with us. Really appreciate your time. That's Brian Deese. He's White House Director of the National Economic Council. Still to come, the economics and geopolitics of China will take up with Mary Lovely of the Peterson Institute. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Westin. We're going to check in on the markets right now. We have Abigail Doolittle. Abigail, the markets are the equities are sort of mixed, but boy, the meme stocks are really consuming everybody's attention at the moment.
It's pretty incredible. We just had Bed Bath & Beyond and GameStop both halted for volatility. At this point on the day alone, Bed Bath & Beyond is up 60%. This after being downgraded today because of the 50% move over the last 2 days into today. Over the last 3 weeks, up about 500%. I mean, it's really incredible. All of these stocks just on fire. So a couple weeks ago, Bed Bath & Beyond, there was actually a report that they were seeking private loans for liquidity. So there was some hope that there was a fundamental cause there, turnaround. The Reddit traders, the retail traders really seem to have grabbed on. The bigger point here, though, is, and you, of course, have the short squeeze. Bed Bath & Beyond does have a 50% short interest. All these stocks have a short interest. But I would say the bigger point around these meme stocks, this tells us a lot about the rally that started on June 16th. This is a sentiment indicator. It speaks perhaps to the froth. Maybe the market's getting a little bit ahead of themselves. The fact that these Reddit traders feel so comfortable pushing some of these stocks up, again, 500% in 3 weeks.
So let's go back to something closer to fundamentals. What about Walmart? What about some of the retailers? We were all waiting for those numbers to come out.
Yeah, Walmart's a little bit puzzling to me in a way because the stock is up 6%, and yet this is a company that has guided down 3 times this year, really thrown in the kitchen sink, and investors are just happy that, at this point that it's not continuing to go down in terms of the expectations. So the stock is up about 6%. Home Depot, a little bit cleaner. They beat the quarter. A little, some problems in terms of traffic, but the average ticket sale, I think, was up 9%. So that's sort of positive. Walmart, it's interesting. They're still looking for a decline in earnings, but it's a little bit less than. Home Depot kind of held even. So these aren't great quarters, but it's been so bad, investors.
Also, inflation is really pumping up the overall number.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Even if you're not making a margin on it. Thanks so much to Bloomberg's Abigail Doolittle for that report on the markets. And this is Bloomberg. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Westin. To keep up to date with news from all around the world, we turn now to Mark Crumpton here with the first word. Mark.
David, thank you. President Biden will sign Democrats' landmark climate change and health care bill today. It's what he has called the final piece of his pared-down domestic agenda. The legislation includes the most substantial federal investment in history to fight climate change, some $375 billion over a decade. It also would help an estimated 13 million Americans pay for health care insurance by extending subsidies provided during the coronavirus pandemic. An explosion ripped through a Russian ammunition depot in occupied Crimea this morning. It comes a week after a blast at an airbase on the Black Sea Peninsula. Russian television reported that some 2,000 people were evacuated from the area. An advisor to Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky called the explosion the beginning of a series of attacks. Russia called it an act of sabotage. The European Union is studying Iran's response to a proposed blueprint for reviving the 2015 nuclear deal. The EU says it's also consulting with the U.S. on a way ahead for the protracted talks. Tehran outlined its positions to the bloc late on Monday. The EU says the proposal is the last hope of rescuing an accord that's meant to limit Tehran's nuclear activity in exchange for the lifting of sanctions, including on its energy sector. Kenya's former prime minister is rejecting the outcome of last week's election and vowing to take constitutional steps to challenge it. Kenyan election officials say that William Ruto won the race with 50.5% of the votes. Raila Odinga secured 48.9% of the vote. It was Odinga's fifth run at the presidency. He says the Electoral Commission didn't follow due process and that the results are not legitimate. Global news 24 hours a day, on air and on Bloomberg Quick Take, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in over 120 countries. I'm Mark Crumpton. This is Bloomberg. David?
Thank you so much, Mark. Well, Bloomberg's editor-in-chief, he's John Micklethwait, is in Singapore right now, where he sat down with the incoming Prime Minister, Lawrence Wong, who will be taking over there. And one of the things that Mr. Wong warned about is the increasing tensions between the United States and China over Taiwan.
Both sides understand the consequences and really do not want to go into conflict. The leadership on both sides understand this, but it's, as they say, no one deliberately wants to go into battle, but we sleepwalk into conflict.
To give us her perspective on what's going on in some of the issues with China right now, we welcome Mary Lovely. She's Senior Fellow at the Peterson Institute for International Economics. Mary, great to have you back with us. You heard Mr. Wong there worrying about the possible conflict over Taiwan. At the same time, China's also in the news because their economic numbers came in pretty weak earlier this week. So take us into what is confronting President Xi right now.
Sure. Great to be with you, David. President Xi is confronting a number of both, short-term and long-term challenges. Right now, probably the number one thing is the poor performance of the economy. July came in very disappointing on all aspects, all the gauges, industrial production, retail sales, investment came in lower than analysts' expectations. Growth in the second quarter was almost 0.4%. And consumption has basically collapsed. So there's a real problem with the economy and a growing sense that there's a crisis of confidence brewing among the Chinese consumers, everyday citizens, and businesses as well.
So we've heard some fairly harsh rhetoric out of Beijing about first the Speaker Pelosi's visit to Taiwan and now the second congressional delegation. But is there a sense in which this might actually benefit President Xi because it sort of takes everybody's mind off of some of his economic problems?
Well, politics is the same everywhere. And yes, having someone to rail against is always good to take your mind off domestic troubles. But I think it's not going to buy him very much if the economy continues to move in the direction it's going. Property values, property sales continue to fall. So we've got a problem with possibly disorganized busting of the property bubble. China can control it. It has the resources, but disorder in the markets, it's something that definitely could become chaotic. It's not something they want to see, particularly at this point in the political cycle. As we all know, President Xi heads toward historic third term.
Of course, that third term is critically important to President Xi. At the same time, they are into a new structure of their economy. They're trying to pursue it's consumer-driven, where they can drive it themselves rather than just export-driven. You mentioned the property market. As I understand it, that constrains spending by consumers in part because a lot of their wealth is tied up in their property. But you also have the shutdowns from COVID that make it uncertain whether you can get out. And you also have a very high level, like 20% of youth unemployment.
Oh, you're hitting all the main points there, David. It's a bleak outlook if you're a Chinese householder. China's citizens have been constrained in what they can invest in, so they're overly invested in the property market. This absolutely hurts their ability to see a future where their consumption will grow. They're pulling back, batten down the hatches. That's bad news for businesses. Even with the small rate cut that we saw yesterday, what business wants to invest if they don't see the possibility for growth in sales? So there are lots of things that are weighing on the Chinese consumer. The high level of youth unemployment, I think, is particularly worrisome for the leadership. 20% youth unemployment is very high. And of course, it can be a challenge to social stability. So the need to revive the economy to get jobs growing is very important. The railing against the U.S. on Taiwan, I think, is hurting in some sense the international investment community. I do think to some extent it's a bit of a sideshow from the domestic economy perspective. I think it's clear that job growth needs to continue and to continue for youth, not just for those who have some high school or high school graduates, but also they've had trouble getting recent college graduates into jobs. And that's a big problem looking forward for social stability.
So, Mary, what are the tools in President Xi's toolkit right now? Because in the past, my impression has been when something like this happens, they borrow a lot of money and spend it on infrastructure spending, for example. They build some new high-speed trains, things like that. But a lot of the municipalities and a lot of the government levels are really levered up quite a bit, aren't they? What can he do?
This is something that a lot of analysts, including myself, have been pointing out, which is that they have few options really here. They did have a 30-point stimulus plan earlier, and it did lead to exhortations to local governments to borrow, to build, to get people to work. That hasn't gone very well for precisely the reason that you mentioned, David. The local governments are already heavily invested. It's not clear what they can do other than throwing more borrowing at bad investments. So it's really a problem. They're not talking about direct stimulus money. There is a concern already that the interest rate is below that of the Fed rate. And so we have this, inversion of the US and China rate, concerns about making sure that there's not too much pressure on capital markets in terms of capital flight. So they really are in a difficult situation in seeing how to revive. One bright note is that they have continued to make the energy transition. EV sales are way up in July. Thermal, power being generated in thermal plants, coal-fired power plants is down year on year. Solar is way up. So China continues to make the energy transition despite this poor economic performance.
Mary, it's always great to have you on to tell us about China. Thank you so much. That's Mary Lovely of the Peterson Institute. Coming up, the Espionage Act is cited in the search warrant for President Trump's residence. We go through what that means with expert Heidi Kitrosser of Northwestern Law School. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Westin. Well, ever since that search warrant was executed for the residence of former President Donald Trump down in Florida last Monday, actually, we've all been talking about exactly what it means. And then the story even got more interesting last Friday when we got a copy of the warrant itself. And among other things, it cited the Espionage Act as one possible violation that might have occurred. To take us through what this means, we welcome now Heidi Kitrosser. She's a professor of Northwestern Law School. She is an expert in the Espionage Act. So welcome. It's really great to have you with us, Professor. First of all, take us back. Let's do a little history here. It comes out of the Wilson era, right? Isn't the World War I?
Absolutely. The 1917 Espionage Act passed on the eve of the United States entrance into World War I.
Fascinating. So what does it provide, basically, and how would it apply arguably? We don't know exactly what happened here, but arguably, how might it apply in this circumstance?
Right. So, they cited Section 793, and they weren't more specific than that, of course. It was a search warrant. We'll find out more details later, if any. Probably the most relevant piece of Section 793 would be Section 793D. And what that says in a nutshell is that individuals who at one point had authorized lawful access to what the statute calls information relating to the national defense, one who had lawful access to that, but then proceeds to either retain it unlawfully, retain it in the face of requests to return it, or to convey it to others who are not authorized to receive it. It essentially criminalizes that and makes it a crime punishable by fines or up to 10 years of imprisonment.
Now, is the thing that makes it a crime that it was classified?
No. So this is one thing that's very interesting, and it's a pretty common misconception. I think people assume, the Espionage Act, classified information, that automatically criminalizes conveying classified information. What's interesting is the act doesn't anywhere say anything about classified information. There's a really good reason for that, which is that the classification system, or I should say the Espionage Act predates the classification system by several decades. It doesn't say classification. It doesn't even say the words secret. The only definition it really gives of the kind of information at issue is, quote, national information relating to the national defense. Now, what courts have done over the years is they've said, well, that runs the risk of being somewhat vague or overbroad because, that could be so many things. And so we're going to narrow it a little bit. We're going to read a couple of things into it. And so courts essentially have read two requirements two refinements into the definition of information relating to the national defense. One is that it has to be information that one could reasonably believe could harm the United States or might be helpful to an enemy of the United States. That's extraordinarily broad, of course, and could cover many things as well. The other requirement they've read in is that the information has to be closely held. Now, courts have generally said, if it's classified, we'll take that to mean it's closely held, but they're not necessarily the same thing. It is possible that information, regardless of its official status, might be treated as secret by the government and not treated as public information.
So let me ask the reverse of that. If something were declassified, does that take it outside the scope of the statute? Because, as you know, President Trump now is claiming that he had something of a standing order to declassify anything he took with him to Mar-a-Lago.
Yeah, that is a fascinating wrinkle in this whole thing. So it does not necessarily take it out of the statute for, essentially for the reason, again, that neither the statute nor the judicial gloss on it requires that the information be classified. The way in which that could matter is it could have bearing on whether the information is, quote, closely held, right? If information is properly classified and no one's disputing that it was, that makes it much easier to say it's closely held by the government. However, if Trump really did declassify it in some way, then we'd have to look into, well, what exactly does that mean? How did he purport to declassify it? And even if he somehow made it achieve declassified status, it could still be closely held. So, for example, he said, I declassified it. So far, it seems to be a mystery how he did that, right? Was it a written order? Was it an oral order? Was it telepathic? His former national security advisor, John Bolton, said he never heard of such a thing. So if Trump declassified it in his mind, or declassified it simply by telling a couple of people, but left all of the classification markings, didn't consider it subject to open government laws, effectively still treated it the same as though it were closely held by the government, then there's an argument 793 still applies just the same.
So, Professor, one last one here, and maybe this is too much in the details, is the gravamen of the offense, is the basic core of the offense that you have this material, they've asked for it back, and you didn't give it back to them. And the reason I ask that question is this. A lot of people are saying, why is this any different from what happened with Hillary Clinton's server when she was Secretary of State and she had apparently some classified documents on there, shouldn't have been there? I'm not aware that anybody asked for them back and she refused. Is that the difference between the two cases?
Yeah, there are, I think, a couple of things that could be different. And of course, a lot of the devil will be in the details that will presumably unfold over time. I think one difference, absolutely, is the fact that reportedly, at least, there was a lot of back and forth between the Trump people and the Justice Department seeking the information. It sounds like the Trump team had every reason to believe this was closely held national security information, regardless of Trump's subjective view of its classification status. Another difference is whether or not the retention and possibly any conveyance, although I haven't heard anything alleged yet about conveyance to those not authorized to receive it, whether or not it was done knowingly, because the statute does have a willfulness requirement, or whether it was done with gross negligence, which is a different category. And my understanding is the latter that they were considering with respect to Hillary Clinton.
Fascinating. Thank you so much, Professor. This was really helpful. I learned a lot. That's Heidi Kitrosser. She's a law professor at the University of Northwestern. And by the way, author of Reclaiming Accountability, Transparency, Executive Power, and the U.S. Constitution. Coming up, we go to Jackson Hole, Wyoming for a report on Congresswoman Liz Cheney's battle to keep her seat. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Westin. Well, it is primary day in Wyoming and also in Alaska. And a lot of people are watching Wyoming because of Liz Cheney, that daughter of the former vice president and also current congresswoman from Wyoming, who is fighting to keep her seat even though she has opposed President Trump. We have our own Billy House, crack Bloomberg congressional reporter, out there in Jackson Hole, Wyoming, to give us a report. So how does it look from out there, besides the fact that it's beautiful, Billy?
Well, it's beautiful. You're right about that. And it doesn't look so beautiful, though, for Liz Cheney. She's way down in the polls. And even House GOP leader Kevin McCarthy is here at a separate event bragging that her opponent has already won.
Oh, that's interesting. Is he fixing to be a majority leader, you think? Speaker of the House, I mean?
He is. That's what he certainly hopes. We won't know that, of course, until Democrats and Republicans vote in January. But he thinks he's got a lock on being the nominee by his party in party elections after the midterm voting.
So, Billy, some of us who don't know Wyoming nearly as well as you do sort of assume it's Cheney country out there, that they've been in office, various places for a long time, and that they really are beloved in Wyoming. How could she lose?
Well, the very fundamental reason why she's going to lose is this state Trump carried the state by 70% of the vote almost. And Cheney has now spent the last 2 years thumping Trump. So the ostracization, the blowback, not only in Washington against the former vice president's daughter, but really here in the state has been really vitriolic. And to boot, she isn't the greatest campaigner. There are complaints everywhere that she doesn't really do public events. People surrounding her say that's because of security concerns, but that's certainly not a great way to campaign.
So is she thinking about the next job?
A lot of speculation about that. She won't answer if, for instance, she's considering even a bid for the presidency in 2 years, which would be strange to campaign to be, sort of mulling over a presidential race while you're losing a congressional campaign. But this is a different sort of animal here. Is that she's been very prominent, of course, as a Trump opponent. And despite her conservative credentials, has kind of been making inroads with some moderate Democrats. That's been her pitch, hasn't it? Democrats come over and vote for me? It has been. It's a tough way for some of them to swallow. At an event just last week, she was pounded on her social positions, abortion, national security, and other things. But many of them are going to vote for her, just not enough today. If, in fact, she decides to do something else, she's going to have a fair amount of money, is she not? I think she's raised a lot of money. I don't think she's spent it all. That's absolutely true. She's raised over $15 million, but even though she's apparently losing and going to lose big, she's got $7 million still tucked away in her war chest. So, for whatever reason she's done that or saved that money, I guess we'll see. One more, Billy. I heard tell that she's going to be giving a speech this evening. Yes, and everybody's going to watch to see if that is feisty. I'm not done. You'll see me again. I'm coming back. This is what I'm going to do, or something else. So I kind of lean toward the former. And whether her father will be with her, that'll be fascinating. That will be fascinating. Billy, thank you so much. Have a good time out there in Jackson Hole. It's Billy House, Bloomberg congressional reporter. Thank you. Check out the Balance of Power newsletter on the terminal and online. Coming up on Balance of Power, we're going to continue on Bloomberg Radio. In our second hour, we'll talk to Dr. John Schwartzberg of UC Berkeley Public Health about reports of polio being detected in New York City sewage water. This is Balance of Power, and we are on Bloomberg Television and on Bloomberg Radio.